How's everybody doing? I have to be honest, I miss all you guys. Talking to the screen is not as exciting and stuff, so I'm going to try to keep the energy up today. We got quite a bit to get through today, some heavy topics for sure, so we're going to try to tackle this as best we can. But first and foremost, I hope you all are well and everything's going okay. So this is for Wednesday, March 25th, and we're continuing in Chapter 31, World War II, and we're going to be talking about the Holocaust today, the Japanese internment camps, how the war in Europe ended, and then how the Allied powers took on the war in the Pacific. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so as we know, Hitler to the outside world, his aggression was really clear, his hatred of communism was really clear, and in his manifesto, Mein Kampf, he talked about, who to blame, and the biggest cause. There were many people that he, blamed for the downfall of the Germans, especially after World War I, but he went even further back than that. The problems or issues that Germany faced, why it took them so long to unify, why they haven't been given respect, why they economically aren't as successful as they could be. And he kept coming back to his main target were Jews, okay, subgroups, but particularly Jews. So people over time were so angry that they were they liked this rhetoric. They wanted someone to blame. They wanted somebody to point their finger at. And if you look back in history, we talked about this before. Why is it that the Jews, more than any other group, have been persecuted? And there's a couple reasons. One, because they're minority groups, so it's easier to pick on or to pick out a minority group. You don't tend to pick the majority, right? That kind of goes against, human nature. You pick the smaller group to pick on. Being a minority religion, that makes it easier to pick on or in people's minds to justify because they're different than us, so to speak, kind of quotes around that. And there was a lot of jealousy of the general success of Jews. There's a lot of stereotypes that, Jews are successful, they're rich, or they're more educated. And there's an element of truth to that. That's an over-exaggerated generalization, but there's an element of truth that they did tend to be more successful. They did tend to have higher rates of education. For example, remember we talked about, during the witch trials and stuff, Jews were really often targeted during the Black Death because people didn't like that they could charge interest on loans, and the Catholic Church wouldn't let people in Europe do that, so that a lot of people targeted them. So think about that same kind of attitude, kind of carrying forward, okay? So it's not like overnight Hitler rounds up the Jews and sends them to the concentration camps. Because in general, if people had known, and let me say this right up front, majority of Germans did not know to the extent it was going on. We'll talk about that today, how it slowly increases, okay? People felt, yes, we need to control them, they need to take responsibility, but it wasn't outright said we need to send them to camps and kill them, exterminate them. That wasn't the dialogue. It was general dialogue that people would go along with. So it starts small, and extremism doesn't happen overnight. Extremism is slowly built up, okay? So it's slowly built up. So here's how he did it. So first it was, we need to blame someone, I need to take control. So Hitler gains control, he starts rebuilding their economy, he starts, violating the Treaty of Versailles, he's taking back land, he's rebuilding their military, and everybody's excited about it. They're like, wow, look at what he's doing. And the more successful he is, the more faith they put him, the more they're willing to give him leeway because they feel he's kind of earned their trust or he's proven themselves. So then he starts to restrict the rights of Jews and target the Jews, okay? So one of the first examples would be the Nuremberg Law. So the Nuremberg laws were a set of laws that didn't remove Jews at first, it was limiting Jews, okay? And a lot of people in Germany got on board because they were kind of like, yeah, this is the proactive thing we need to do. The Jews need to pay, they need to be put in their place. And so here's what it was, they cannot marry non-Jews. So the outside perspective, the prejudice was, yeah, we can't have them infiltrating our main, population. Okay, they can't teach in our schools. Again, parents really got on board with this. Yeah, we can't have them, giving their propaganda, brainwashing our children. Well, then we can't have them in government position, right? Yeah, because look how they got away with this all along. They're in positions of power and they could take advantage of that. Well, we can't have them practicing law or medicine. They might poison us or, again, infect us with their ideas. We can't have them publishing books because their propaganda will get out there. And then this was the really big one, okay? They are not citizens of the Reich. They're not citizens of this country. So they live here, but they don't have the same rights as a citizen. So think in our own country, the difference between having a green card and being a citizen, or being an illegal immigrant here and being a citizen, you do not have as many rights. And so that gives the government the ability without being questioned, to violate Jews and to be harsher toward Jews, and they couldn't by putting that in there. So you started with these laws, okay, and he used them as scapegoats, and because he had had so much success, people got on board with that. Then there was the night of broken glass. So as things were escalating, this was a pivotal moment where it was no longer just about laws. So these laws built things up 1936, 1937, and then 1938, this was a big turning point toward the push of the next stage of isolating Jews, which was removing them. So in November of 1938, over the course of 2 days, over 1,000 synagogues were burned, 7,000 Jewish businesses were trashed, looted, burned, dozens were killed, their cemeteries, hospitals, homes were closed, looted, and then there was the next step. So first it was laws just to segregate them, to prohibit them, okay? But then that wasn't enough. Once people got comfortable with that after the night of broken glass, then it elevated more. Okay, so after the Nuremberg laws and the Night of Broken Glass, things are really going to elevate, okay? So 1937, 1938 is really, you know, the building up, segregating them, moving them to the outskirts of town, the ghetto. So in 1939, we see the next step. And again, as Hitler had more and more successes of revitalizing, you know, German success and things like that, once the war started, then he was able to justify in people's minds taking it to the next level, which was removing people from the ghettos and taking them to these relocation camps, these concentration camps. Now, to the outside world, he advertised it as almost like a summer camp. He literally had video campaigns that he would put out that it looked like, oh, look at, they have these little cabins and they're hanging out, and it's almost like if you've ever gone to like summer camp or church camp, you know, and then they go to the dining hall, and then afterwards they sit around and play music and, you know, do s'mores around the campfire and have tea time, and the women get together and do their crafts with the kids. So to the people of Germany, they justified it in their minds that, oh, see, it's for our safety, but they're still okay. They justified in their minds that what they were doing is okay. But once Hitler was able to remove them out of sight of the main society, which most people thought this is what it was, because of the propaganda, or justified in their minds, oh, it's for our safety, and see, it's actually not that bad, you know, to make their conscience feel better, so to speak. He was able to do what he ultimately wanted to do, which was his final solution, okay, which was to execute the Jews. So here's what would happen. They would load them up. They literally would come in with swarms. They would give them 15 minutes, load up whatever they could in a suitcase. They would put them on a train, basically cattle cars. They would ship them off to these concentration camps. Now, when they would arrive at the concentration camps, okay, they would be playing opera music, German opera music. Hitler loved German opera music, so they would be playing this over the loudspeakers. And this would go on as people are getting off of the trains, trying to calm them. So as they're getting off the trains, what they would do is they would segregate them into two separate lines. So as the PowerPoint tells you, okay, they're going to have one with the very young children. You know, all of you, 15, 16, you would probably be considered able-bodied working, so they would probably put you in a separate line. So young, probably like my kids' age, you know, little children still really dependent on their parents. The elderly, the sick, you know, people that they felt like they couldn't use in the factories or for production right then, and immediately they would put them in a separate line. Then those who were young men and women in their teens, 20s, 30s, you know, able-bodied, good health, they would put in a separate line. Now, what they would tell them is, oh, don't worry, you're going to get relocated, you know, back together here later. We're just going to get you checked in. We're going to issue you a uniform. We're going to give you a haircut, get a shower, and you'll come back together. Now, that was true for the middle-aged, for the healthy young men and women that they deemed that could be workers for a while before they killed them. And they would give them haircuts. They would shave their heads to reduce lice. They would give them a shower, and they would issue them, you know, uniforms which almost look like pajamas. Everyone else, as we know, or, you know, as we've learned through history, if you've ever talked about the genocide, they would tell them, okay, remove all these things. You're going to go in, you're going to take a shower. And then they could fit about 300 to 400 people in these rooms, which were actually gas chambers. They would tell them they were taking a shower, and they would get gassed. Now, originally they would line them up and kill them, but you know, with a firing squad or something like that, but that became very inefficient in Hitler's eyes. It was a waste of ammunition, and with the war going on, they needed all of that toward the front lines and the war efforts. So they created these massive gas chambers where they could, like I said, 300 to 400 people at a time, gas them. So put them in there over the course of 30 minutes, let that gas seal it off, and let them, you know, let them die of suffocation and the poison, which is absolutely horrific. Then they would take the body. So at first, you can see in the bottom picture, they would dig these massive pits, and they would try to bury them. But the problem was they literally couldn't. They were killing them so quickly they couldn't keep up with it. So they created, as you see in the top photo, they created these huge fire pits, almost like imagine like a massive pizza oven, you know what I mean? Where they could put dozens of bodies at a time and basically, incinerate, cremate the bodies, and then just spread the ashes to get rid of them. And they say that they would burn the bodies so much it would just fill the air, with ash, and it would just smell horrible from burning flesh. But because it was so removed from main societies, a lot of mainstream people didn't know. There were rumors of these camps, but most people believed the propaganda and they justified it. They didn't, even if they did, they didn't want to believe it. You know what I mean? Out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. Now, the younger people who were kept alive for working in this and that, they were kept alive till they were deemed so sick that they were no longer of any use, and again would then be put into the gas chambers, and then their bodies would be burned. And in the meantime, they would be used to help produce things for war, necessities, canning, mechanical weapons, and things like that, agriculture and things like that. Now, it wasn't just Jews. They estimate about 12 million people died during the Holocaust, and however many more millions that survived that, were held, and their lives obviously forever altered and damaged because of this. But about half of the 12 million, about 6 million were Jews, and the other half was a combination of people. So gypsies, those who were mentally ill, homosexuals. Hitler absolutely was against the church. He executed a lot of people. He was absolutely against, anyone who was gay or of a different sexuality. And a lot of different subgroups. So it wasn't just Jews, but they by far were the biggest target. And again, people in their minds justified this because they thought that it was helping society, and look, it's not that bad. And even a lot of soldiers didn't realize how bad it was. Okay, to take a little bit more of a look at the Holocaust. So we know that this was Hitler's final solution, and sometimes the question comes up, why is it that we talk about, the Holocaust maybe more so than other genocides? I mean, there have been other horrific genocides in history, such as, the Armenian genocide after, around World War I, and Darfur genocide in the 90s, early 2000s, and several other genocides. And there's a couple reasons for that. The biggest reason is probably the numbers, and second is documentation. Like I said, they estimate about 12 million people died, and several more million obviously affected forever because of this, even if they survived it. About 6 million Jews died, another 6 million of, different subgroups died from this. The other thing is documentation. Oh my goodness, there's no other genocide where we have this much documentation. If you look to the right a little bit, the one of the man being pushed in the hole, or the German soldier hanging this boy and this girl that's already been hung. These are pictures left behind by the Germans. The medical files that they left behind. The Germans were absolutely fascinated with medical experimentation, unfortunately, on Jews and people in the concentration camps. When the war ended in 1945, it ended so quickly that the Germans basically abandoned the concentration camps a day or two before the Allied powers rolled in. So therefore not destroying the evidence. The Allied powers, just like a lot of everyday citizens of the Axis powers, did not realize to what extent was going on. They thought it was, as I've said, they thought it was, relocation camps, working camps, not great situations, but certainly not to the extent that they expected. So when the Allied powers rolled in, they literally found these pictures. They found medical records. Here's some examples of some of the medical experiments that they did on people. They, for instance, they would do gas chamber experiments or altitude experiments. So they would create an altitude chamber. They would put a Jew or, a gypsy or someone else that was there that they didn't care that died, and they would intensify the altitude as if you were in a plane to see at what extent the brain would explode, or you would pass out and you would die. Another example they loved, were fascinated with identical twins. So if you're identical twins, you know who you are. This would be just super disturbing, absolutely crazy what they would do. So they would take identical twins and maybe inject different substances into their eyes to see how it would change their eyes or their vision, shaving their body, using different chemicals on them to see the different reactions that, twins would have to them. I mean, absolutely sick things. One of the grosser things that they would do. So you remember in Soviet Union, they were losing the war, and a lot of that was due to the stalemate and the scorched earth that the Soviet Union was practicing. And so they were desperate to try to find a way, like, is there a way once a soldier has hypothermia or something to resuscitate them or revitalize them? So they would take a Jew or someone in the work camps, and they would strip them down naked. They would strap them to a gurney, and they would put them outside. And they would monitor them and wait for them to die of freeze to death, basically, hypothermia. Then they would inject either through the mouth or through the rear end, spots, warm fluids or boiling fluids, and they would see at what temperature the body would, if the body could be resuscitated or if it would burn the body from the inside out. I mean, absolutely disgusting things. Now, the pictures that you see here on the left of the pile of bodies, the skeletons, these men that are clearly are, a couple days, if not weeks away from dying due to starvation. These were taken by the Allied powers. In fact, they say that when the Allied powers rolled in, the generals went to the local villages as close as they could find and would bring locals in to see what was going on because they were afraid that people wouldn't believe it. And they took pictures like crazy because this is something, again, that out of sight, out of mind, and people like to deny things, and certainly the Germans were going to deny it. And so the Allied powers didn't want to be accused of possibly being able to forge this or try to make the Germans look bad. So they literally would round up and bring in busloads of local people to be like, look at what's been going on, look at what your government's done, look at what your country has done. And so you can't deny it, and taking pictures of this. And what's crazy is still today there are groups of people who deny this. I'm sorry not to call anybody out, but like Great Britain, they have banned this from a lot of their public curriculum. There are countries in the Middle East or parts of Eastern Europe that refuse to talk about this and deny and say it's folklore, it's propaganda. And it's absolutely, I'm sorry, crazy to me to think that anybody could deny that these kind of things could happen. And so that is part of the reason that we talk about it, the sheer numbers, but just the documentation. It's just no other genocide has been so documented than the Holocaust. Okay, so the question becomes is, what's going on in the meantime? So as to recap yesterday, I talked about 1942 was kind of the halftime, so to speak, right? Germany and the Axis powers, along with Italy and, Soviet Union till Hitler turned his back on them, have been very successful taking Eastern Europe. France is out of it. Great Britain is, down, hasn't given in, but is down. The U.S., our Pacific Fleet has been destroyed. Japan is getting whatever they want. Southeast Pacific, Hitler's getting whatever he wants. So 1942 is a turning point. So if you see that as kind of the halftime of the war, it's a turning point. So the Yalta Conference is kind of the meeting of the new Allied powers. Now, if you look at this picture, picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Okay. You have Winston Churchill of Great Britain, who is the bulldog, and he's there because Britain needs help, right? Because they have been destroyed from Operation Sea Lion and Germany bombing them for a year. You have the U.S. there, so you have FDR there, who is interested in the plan. How are we going to do it? And then you have Stalin, who doesn't want to be there. I mean, look at that nose. Nobody's really happy to be there, but him in particular. And he again, as they speak in 1942, Hitler and the Nazis are in his country, and again, they're at a stalemate. So all of them are meeting going, okay, how do we bring this war to an end? Now, for them, they had really a two-front war. You have Hitler as the main threat with the backing of Italy and Europe, and then you have Japan, who has invaded China, and at this point, by 1942, has consumed all of Southeast Asia. And so now the question becomes, who do we take first? Because just like for Hitler, in order to be effective, you need to avoid a two-front war. The Allied powers also need to be effective. Now, so here's the decision that they come to, okay? They come to the fact that they see Hitler or the Nazis as the first threat and Japan as the secondary threat. Now, it would be interesting based on your perspective, right? Obviously, Britain is going to see Hitler as the bigger threat because he's just bombed the crap out of them and they want revenge. Stalin is going to see Hitler as the biggest threat because he's in their country right now and won't leave. Now, who do you think U.S. would see as the bigger threat? Think about it for a second. Probably Japan, right? Because they bombed Pearl Harbor. But 2 out of 3, it's agreed that the greatest immediate threat is Hitler. We need to get rid of Hitler, and he was seen as the stronger branch or the stronger body. So get rid of him first. That'll isolate Japan, then take out Japan. So the plan from the Yalta Conference in 1942, the halftime meeting of the Allied powers, who are greatly losing up to this point, agree, okay, we're going to take care of the war in Europe first, then we'll take care of the war in the Pacific. That way we're not splitting our forces and, divide and conquer to get this done. Now, this meeting was rough. It's not like they were happy to work together. Again, this was a meeting of necessity. Churchill felt that Stalin wanted to dominate Europe, which he had, and he had been on Hitler's side. So there was, believe me, not a lot of love lost, and for the first half of the year or first half of the war had been against Britain. Roosevelt basically felt everybody just wanted a free ride, that they were trying to mooch off of the U.S., which was true. Soviet Union was not in a good spot. Britain is greatly injured after, the Nazi bombing of them. And so we know we're going to have to carry a big part of the load, and we're kind of sour about that. Stalin didn't trust anybody because he felt everybody wanted to destroy communism, which was true. So all this distrust between them was absolutely justified, but out of necessity, they had to come together. Now, if you look at this picture, I do want to point one thing out I think that's really interesting. And that is, if you look at Roosevelt and Churchill, they are wearing business attire, right? And if you look at Stalin, what is he wearing? Military general uniform. And that really tells you the difference between democracy, when it's a representation of the people. Democratic governments tend to see things almost like an economic boardroom, like a CEO coming in and you wear a suit and it's justified. It's a negotiation. I might be in charge, but it's a negotiation, right? It's a discussion. Nobody's going to get shot at the table. Versus in the military, what attitude do you have to have? If your commander gives you a command, do you sit around the table and talk about it? No, you do it or you get in trouble. In this case, in a lot of cases, you get shot, if you're in the Communist Party. So it really is a coming together out of necessity and shows you the differences in ideology at that time. Now, we've talked about total war before. So think back to World War I, what I talked about, what total war means, okay? As a society, as a culture, and for a people, okay? So what does that mean? So when I say that countries went to total war, it was everybody. Soviet Union, Britain, France, US, in order to overcome the Axis powers, the Allied powers had to completely flip everything over. And this is really the first time the US had to do that. The US had to do that. We were in for a long fight. We joined World War I at the end, and it was just not a big deal. But this is going to be a fight, and really we're the underdogs at this point. So in the US particularly, factories had to be converted, from manufacturing, household goods and appliances to airplanes and tanks, rationing of food. Women had to go to work, the freezing and regulating of prices. We see that a little bit right now. Remember, companies maybe with the shortage of toilet paper, sanitation, Clorox wipes, bleach, things like that, hand sanitizer. People are tempted to jack up prices, and government have laws in order to keep them from doing that, taking advantage of that. It did bring the Depression to an end. It put everybody to work. The men went off to fight. The women came to work. They limit freedom of speech. They can't have a divided country. So they censor the press and what the press can say. And propaganda is really pushed toward the war effort. It's a time of unification, and we'll deal with individual rights later. Here's, unfortunately, though, something else that happened. And I'm really curious. Usually I do a poll in class of who's heard about this or who's talked about this. But I want you to think about this for a second, okay? We had just experienced something. We had just been attacked by the Japanese. We actually had a fairly large Japanese immigrant population in Hawaii and on the Pacific coast, specifically like up in Washington area, in California area, in the early 1900s. So we had actually a fairly large immigrant population. And after the attack of Pearl Harbor, think about back to, you weren't alive at the time, but I'm sure you've heard things or we've seen ramifications from it from 9/11. When 9/11 happened and it was made known that it was, extremists from the Middle East, the outcry targeted the majority population of the Middle East, which was the majority religion, which was Muslims, right? Whether fair or not, in a lot of cases not fair, completely targeting them, taking a small minority and turning it into this propaganda majority that people target, and it leads to prejudice and racism. Sorry, I'm fumbling over my words right now. So think about the increased scrutiny in airports. If you dressed a certain way, if you had a certain skin color, that you would be more likely to be stopped, to be randomly selected. And as I say that, I'm doing quotes with my fingers, when we all know you're not really being randomly selected. If you look like someone from a Middle East or Arabic country, or if you looked Muslim, they were absolutely more likely to, again, randomly, with quotes, stop you, when really that's not what it is. It's profiling, right? This same thing was happening, but even to a more extreme after this. After Pearl Harbor, people were mad. They were angry. How dare they attack us? How dare they? And unfortunately, anyone who was not only immigrants of Japan, but looked Asian at all. We've all seen the stereotypes. We've talked about this in class where somebody might go, oh, you're Asian, right? Or something like that. And you're like, okay, well, that's a really vague term. Just like saying, oh, you're Latino, right? Or, oh, you're Hispanic, right? Like, what does that even mean? Like that is such a huge generalization that takes away someone's identity. And so anyone that even appeared Asian in any way, shape, or form was targeted in the media, businesses, on the streets. They were kicked out of schools. They were fired. Businesses didn't want them in their restaurants. It was absolutely horrific. And it went so far as to target them and say they could no longer be in society. So here's what happened. In early 1942, this is true, Congress put forth a memo that anyone that was deemed a fourth Japanese, so descendant, so if your grandparents were Japanese, then, you know, if one of your parents was half and one parent was, let's say, white, then you would be a fourth Japanese. You had to report to these internment camps, is what they called them, relocation camps. So here's what would happen. You were given a memo and you had a month to sell everything. I mean everything, your business, your home, whatever you could carry. Very similar to the removal of the Jews, I might add. And you had to report to the train stations, and these buses or trains would take you to one of several relocation camps. Now, there were 10 camps total. Majority of the camps were throughout the Midwest and the Southwest. In fact, the largest one was in Potsdam, Arizona. And there were about 110,000 people of Japanese descent, Japanese immigrants that were put into these camps for the remainder of the war from 1942 to 1945. And they literally lost everything. Now, you might be thinking, well, they had a month to sell everything. Yes, but people are going to take advantage of that. You had a month to sell your home. Think about the panic right now, the market and things like that. People could take advantage of that. And so people were literally having to sell their homes for a fourth of the price, half the price, not getting nearly what they should have for those things and leaving everything and going to these camps. So this photo that you see right here on this slide, this is a picture from the Arizona internment camps. And honestly, looking at it, they look very much like the concentration camps of the Holocaust. Now, here's a map of the location of all of these camps. So anything with, so you'll see the relocation centers, the isolation centers, they're all throughout the Midwest and the West Coast, and majority of them, again, in the Southwest. California, Arizona had the largest of those. You have to think about how miserable these camps would be. Literally think about the heat in the summer here. These are, so this middle building is like a bathroom, and then these outside buildings, these are going to be huge, where you could have 50 to 60 people basically sleeping on bunk beds. Again, very similar to what the concentration camps look like. In the summertime, there's no AC. There's no fans, there's no electricity in these units. Think how hot it gets here, and it gets even hotter in Arizona. Think about the bugs, the wind, the dust. In the wintertime, people don't realize it, but it gets cold in the desert. You know, it gets cold, and people don't like to think about that. And how cold it would get, and they would have one little stove in the corner to burn. They had these communal showers, restrooms for people, and it was horrific. It was absolutely horrific. Now, in 1945, people, you know, sometimes like say, oh, well, at least we didn't kill them. Yeah, but we still ruined their lives. We're supposed to be better than that. We're supposed to be a democratic society where, you know, despite all men are created equal, right? It's in our Declaration of Independence, despite race, despite religion, despite all these different things. But that's not what happened. And here's what's really messed up. So in 1945, when they were released from the internment camps, they were given a one-way bus ticket and about $100 and said, okay, go wherever you want. That was it, you guys. That was it. It's not like they got their homes back, they got their businesses back, nothing. And on top of that, a lot of places they went, communities wouldn't let them in. They wouldn't rent to them. They wouldn't hire them. It took a good decade for a lot of Japanese immigrants to really get resettled. Horrible prejudice and racism toward them and treatment toward them. And there was no protections for them, and the government gave them nothing. It wasn't until the early 90s that the U.S. government officially apologized, recognized that what they did was wrong, and gave equivalent of only those who were surviving. So at this point, think by the 90s, this is, 40 years later, 50 years later, a lot of these people in the internment camps have died. They gave $17,000 to all survivors of of reparations, basically to any survivor in the 1990s. $17,000. That's not even enough to buy a decent used car to make up for ruining their lives and all the prejudice and violating their civil rights. Even if they were a citizen of this country, there was no evidence. It's not like it was, oh, well, they've been communicating with family back home, so there's evidence maybe that they've been spies. It didn't matter. It did not matter. Only because of your heritage were you removed, and nothing else mattered. And it's absolutely horrific to think. So we spend a lot of time talking about the Holocaust, and I'm not saying that this had the same damage, but this still, in this country, which is supposed to be better than that stuff, which is supposed to have a democracy that, checks and balances, that doesn't allow this to happen. A lot of schools, I never learned about this until I was in college, you guys. Literally, I had a professor say, okay, now we're going to talk about the Japanese American internment camps during the war. And I'm like, what are you talking about? No clue. I think that that's starting to change, and a lot of teachers now, like myself, are taking upon themselves to educate students. But this was a reality at the time, which was absolutely horrible for so many families. And if you are of Asian descent or Japanese Asian descent or are Japanese, I would be curious maybe if your family went through this and what that experience was like. And I wish that we were in class right now so I could hear that, because it's so good to hear firsthand what these people went through, just to help us be sensitive and aware of, no country is against extremism, unfortunately, even in the United States. Okay, women are going to have a role in this war. Let me tell you, okay? While the men were off fighting, we had actually a much more of a role in this war. Here's Rosie the Riveter. You see, she's dressed up. She's a mechanic. She's working like a man. We enrolled in supportive roles in the armed forces, so as drivers or airplane pilots or decoders or nurses. So we weren't allowed on the front lines, but we did have an important role in support, and that support was definitely upped or more recognized than in the First World War. So the agreement was at the Yalta conference was that Italy was going to be Europe, we were going to wrap up the war in Europe first, and then we were going to take care of the war in the Pacific. So the war in Europe started with, how do we surround Germany? Okay, so here's what's going to happen. The Soviet Union is going to attack from the Soviet Union, so they're going to start pushing back on the Eastern Front. Okay, France is completely occupied by Germany, so German forces are all throughout Eastern Europe, Germany, and France. And so they decided that they needed to isolate Germany, which the closest, you could say, friend or ally of the Germans was Italy. And Italy was seen as obviously weaker than Germany. So the plan is that the Soviet Union would push back from the east, okay, from their own country, and push back the Germans, but that the Americans and British forces would invade through North Africa, across the Mediterranean, through Italy, get rid of Italy first, get rid of Mussolini first, to isolate Hitler so he had no one to turn to. So by July 1943, we're going to start our invasion of Italy, which is going to take a long time. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Mussolini was strong, okay, and Hitler was strong, and this was going to be no easy task. So first, we crossed into, again, North Africa, crossed over to Sicily, kind of island hop, so to speak, onto the mainland, and slowly started to push back the Italian forces. And the goal was to overthrow Mussolini, which we eventually did. The Germans tried to come to his rescue, but in doing that, they are fighting on the French front. They're fighting the Soviet Union. Now they've opened up a third front, trying to help the Italians ward off the French and the American forces in Italy. So by doing this, it not only is going to try to isolate Germany, but it's going to weaken Germany by opening up another front that they have to defend.
In July 1943, Allied troops struck off from North Africa in Operation Husky. Their mission was to invade Sicily, the stepping stone to the European continent. Within a month, the Italian island was under Allied control, and Italians revolted against their fascist leader, Benito Mussolini. Italy's king stripped Mussolini of power and turned his back on Hitler, quitting the Axis alliance. War-weary Italians rejoiced. Despite the success of Operation Husky, it would take another 18 months of bloody fighting to drive the remaining Axis forces out of Italy. In April 1945, Mussolini was captured by Italian resistance fighters while trying to flee the country. The once pompous dictator was executed, and his body hung in Milan Square.
So as you can see, and this took us quite a while. It took almost 2 years to slowly make progress through North Africa, to push through Sicily, and to slowly push back the Italian forces. But this was the path of least resistance, and again, trying to open up a three-front war for Hitler to slowly wear him down, so to speak. Okay, sorry about that. My kid's running in because their video is over. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up. Okay, so after we're making progress in Italy and we're moving back, okay, the U.S. then decides in 1944 to put more pressure on the French border because the Soviets are putting, pressure on their eastern front. So imagine the map, okay. The British U.S. forces are coming in from the south, so now they're filling, on their southern border, and now we need to put pressure in the west, okay. Plus, the French are like, we want our country back, okay. So probably one of the most, a big turning point, and definitely one of the largest battles that we were involved in World War II is D-Day, okay? And D-Day is the invasion of France, okay? The beaches of Normandy. Now, this invasion was by far one of our most costly invasions. Anytime you are invading from water to land, you're going to have high casualties. So we went into this knowing that it was going to be really difficult, okay? So they had 176,000 troops invade the beaches that morning. They invaded at 6:30 a.m. They had over 5,000 ships. It was about a 50-mile stretch. Those casualties alone on the beaches on our side were over 10,000 men. 10,000 men casualties just that day alone. We knew it was going to be horrible. But there was no other choice. We had to put the pressure. We had to start pushing back. And we had the strongest forces. The British just didn't have the forces. So after a year of pushing in through Italy, the Soviets are pushing, on the eastern front. Now we need to start pushing on a western front, creating a three-front war, weakening and surrounding of the Germans, kind of, so to speak, slowly surrounding and squeezing them until they finally give in. And we did take back France pretty quickly. The casualties were absolutely horrible. The Normandy, they say the total casualties were about 209,000, over 40,000 of those deaths. So when they say casualties, they're talking about deaths and injury. And about 40,000 soldiers died from that battle alone. And a lot of those were Allied U.S. soldiers. Absolutely horrific. But a huge turning point necessary because once you take back France, not only are the French happy, all right, but you're giving that Western pressure on the Germans, okay, and starting to squeeze them back and isolate them. So by the fall of 1944, the Soviets are moving in on the east. Italy is about done. Mussolini's on the run. He eventually is captured. What I find interesting, if you caught that on the video, is that he was hung not only in Milan Square, but he was hung upside down. And this was a big moment because this was publicized on newspapers around the world, and that tells you the strength of media at that time. They hadn't really had that before. So not only is a video of it, but pictures, and they plastered it everywhere. And this was a huge sign of, this is like end of the third quarter, and at halftime, the Axis powers are up so many touchdowns, and the Allied powers are, 45-0, and now it's, end of the third quarter. And the Allied powers aren't quite winning yet, but, we've scored maybe, 30 points, and wow, there's one more quarter and we can come back. So this is really showing, plus it's a momentum. You've all seen that in a game, in any kind of game. When you get a momentum, sometimes it can just totally flip it, and we have a momentum at this point. And people are finally starting to go, oh wow, like this could be done. They could really take out, Hitler. Okay, the final front, or the final kind of, war or battle that we're going to see, the final offensive that the Germans are going to put up, is going to be Battle of the Bulge, okay? So by December 1944, like I said, we've been coming in through the south, through Italy. The Soviet Union, they're coming in from the east. We're coming in from the west. France has been taken back, and now Germany is surrounded. Again, things are getting so bad that people are declaring mutinies. Their soldiers, they have the German soldiers, they've had so many deaths that they're resorting to teenagers, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. I mean, but again, Hitler is just like Kaiser William or Tsar Nicholas II. It doesn't matter how bad it is. They're blinded by their vision. And this is the thing about dictators. They don't care about their people. And no amount of pressure their people are going to put on them will get them to leave. So the final offensive of the war in Europe is going to be Battle of the Bulge, okay? And you'll watch this short video to see why it got the nickname Battle of the Bulge. This was the last all or nothing of the Germans. There was a blitzkrieg that they tried to do, through Belgium, to try to break through the Allied line that was moving on the Western Front, but they weren't successful.
By September, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and much of the Netherlands were freed from Nazi control, while the Soviet Red Army closed in on Germany from the east. By October, the Allies had captured the German city of Aachen, but Hitler ordered a counterattack near the border with Belgium. The resulting dent in the Allied line gave the fight its name, the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies were pushed back with heavy losses of men and equipment. 100,000 Nazi and 19,000 Allied soldiers were killed. But in the end, the German army was forced to retreat. It would be their last offensive. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich was crumbling. His country was in ruin, shattered by the onslaught of bombing and shelling. Over 5 million of his soldiers had surrendered to the advancing Allied armies, and the German spirit was broken. On April 23rd, the Soviet army stormed the German capital of Berlin. In the face of defeat, Adolf Hitler took his own life rather than surrender.
Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
So by December 1944, we were closing in on all sides, and this was the last kind of unified front. And after that, it's just a slow crumble. But this tells you how selfish Hitler was. He wasn't going to give in. The writing was on the wall that it was over, but it didn't matter. And really after that, he goes into his underground bunker and leaves his people to just kind of flee in chaos. So even though the war was pretty much over, we had to push it all the way so that all fronts basically met. So, you know, we're coming in from the south, we're coming in from the west, the Soviets are coming in from the east, and we had to go city by city and bomb them and bomb them and bomb them. You'll see here, 1945, over 135,000 citizens are killed due to Allied bombings in a German city, but Hitler just goes off the radar, so there's no one, you know, giving in. So we just keep going till we basically meet. Hitler was such a coward that in the end, he went into an underground bunker, he and his wife, Eva Braun, who was an actress at the time. And they say April 29th, he went into his underground bunker, just him and some of his closest soldiers. And he basically cuts himself off. And he committed suicide on April 30th. Now, they believe that he poisoned himself with cyanide, and he tested on his dog, believe it or not. So he tested on his dog. I know everybody, whenever I say that in class, everybody's like, oh, the dog, you know. Yes, killed his dog to make sure it would work, and then he and his wife and his closest soldiers committed suicide. No one ever recovered his body. That was probably something that he had mandated to his soldiers because he didn't want to be like Mussolini. You know, he saw the hanging of Mussolini and didn't want to be put on display. And so once he is dead, basically the war is over and there's nothing to keep the war from ending. The victory in Europe really doesn't happen until, as you see in this picture, not only does Hitler commit suicide, but the Allied powers, the British and US, are pushing in from the west, and the Soviets are pushing in from the east, and literally they run into each other. There's nothing else to conquer. They've plowed all the way through Germany, and once they meet, then this is really the official end that that the war is over. Okay. Now, when I say the end of the war, there's technically two ends to the war. Okay. The first date that's going to be important with the end of the war is VE Day, and that's Victory in Europe Day. The war in the Pacific isn't over yet, right? And we're going to talk about that one tomorrow because this lecture is going a little bit long. So VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, is May 7th, 1945, where everyone is rejoicing and is so happy, and it is finally done. And then what is left will then be refocused on the war in the Pacific. Okay, so now Mussolini was taken out. Hitler was, so to speak, squeezed over the course of 2 years until finally he committed suicide, so it's done. And now Japan is literally alone, and they will be the next to be squeezed out. So tomorrow we'll continue with this discussion and talk about then what that strategy looks like, because attacking an island is going to be a lot different than attacking on a mainland. Hope you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.